Welcome to Office Hours on the Red Chip Poker Podcast, and we're talking to James SplitSuit Sweeney today. How's it going, sir?
Not too bad. How are you?
Well, I'm doing great, and one of our favorite subjects on the podcast today, we're going to talk about beating aggressive games. It's something we've touched on before, but these are questions from our actual members and audience, our watchers and listeners out there, our red chippers as we like to call them, just like every other player struggling to find their footing in super aggressive games. I think we've all played in one of these. I mean, do you have any off the cuff, off the top general advice for the player who is playing in one of these games where there's so many raises and so much aggressive play, they just feel completely run over? Maybe there's to start a mindset adjustment that you have to make.
Yeah. One, make sure you have a bankroll to handle this game. A lot of people will play these games from more of a shallow bankroll and get themselves absolutely run over because they're petrified about making any financial mistakes here. Number two is buckle in and buckle up, because this is going to be a fun game. It's going to be a very action-heavy game, but it can also be very, very expensive, especially when you're putting money in with an edge, and unfortunately losing a lot of these things just is what it is. And number three is just don't hesitate to give action as well. Being a nit in the action game rarely is going to benefit you. There are times when everyone is just super, super spewy aggressive and they'll still pay you off even if you're playing nitty. But more often than not, you need to be in there. You need to be giving some action as well. And again, that goes back to number one. Make sure you have the bankroll to handle this. But at the end of the day, we're just playing a game. There's still a lot of frequencies at play here. There's still a lot of hand reading that can be done here. It may not be the easy stuff that you're used to, but it's still all there. And you're just going to have to make some decisions, and your standards and your threshold might lighten up a little bit than what you're necessarily used to in your tighter games. But that's okay. There can still be plenty and plenty of profit here. Don't panic about that at all.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of something Ed Miller says a lot, which is to ask yourself the question, do they want to play for stacks in this spot? So I would imagine when people describe these aggressive games, it's one in which people are actually willing to throw these stacks around. So it sounds like you better be willing to play for the whole chunk of it.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise, what's your option? Call preflop, call flop, fold turn? Call preflop, call flop, call turn, fold river? If your whole goal is to call, hope you improve, and then fold if you don't improve by the river, you're going to lose a lot of small to medium-sized pots. And you're just going to keep topping off. And at the end of the day, you're going to be down 3 buy-ins. And be like, what the heck just happened here? So, yeah, you really have to, make that decision of, yep, I'm going to be giving action here and getting a little bit stickier than maybe I'm quote-unquote used to, and then make that decision and stick to it rather than just, overly panicking, overly folding. Because if those frequencies and those aggressions are really increased, you can't play into their game. Their edge comes from people folding too much, so you can't inherently make that mistake.
Right. And, I'd imagine aggression in cash games versus aggression in tournament, completely different thing. And in tournaments, it's a little heightened because, you could be all in at any moment or challenged with an all in, a lot of low blind situations. And our first question is about that. It comes from Michael K. He's asking, he tells us, I'm playing sit and go starting with a tight jacks plus, suited broadways, ace king range. With guys at the table playing all in often, I lose momentum to counter if I'm not getting playable hands. Every time I get a more marginal hand just to play, one of the aggressive guys sets me all in. Their stacks are higher, so I pass with a mediocre suited hand / low pair. I don't like to wait too long for a good starting hand to counter an all in because of my decreasing stack. Is there any advice other than waiting? I'm going to guess there is. I'm going to guess you have it.
So I'm going to say something, and it's going to sound pretty aggressive, but please know that I only say this with love. You can't say that you're trying to find other spots and opportunities here when you're only looking for jacks plus really strong suited broadways and ace king, right? Because if inherently you're only giving action about 5% of the time and thus folding the other 95, you need to loosen up your standards a little bit if you're serious about giving action and not just blinding yourself out or being blinded into oblivion, because you're not going to find very many playable hands based upon what you've just determined as playable. So what I would be looking for in these games are situations where I can take control and I can be the one that's shoving over the top and trying to pick up the blinds uncontested and trying to apply pressure. Now, sit and goes create some really interesting situations in tournaments in general, so you have to be really aware of the ICM, and you definitely don't want to commit ICM suicide across the way. But just in general, if they're shoving into you, it just sucks. You're at the whim of it. But you should still be looking for spots where you can give it profitable action rather than just always saying, I'm only looking for jacks plus ace king. Because, again, that means you're folding a ton of the time, and those are the people you want to be taking advantage of. The people that are folding too often and have really, really strong standards for giving action. Because if you find that's the case, then yeah, you should be blasting off a ton of the time. Same thing that they're doing, right? Now, maybe they're doing that because they are taking advantage of you. Maybe they're doing that just because they like shoving a lot. Maybe they're doing that because it's 100% the correct thing to do. Difficult to say, so I don't want to give like a broad strokes look there. But what I will say is that if you are consistently folding and consistently playing with these level of hand strengths, then yeah, it's no wonder you're inviting this kind of action. So again, take advantage of people that make this mistake, stop making this mistake as much in the future, and then hopefully that will help at least a little bit. And again, especially when you're playing tournaments and you're in kind of the thralls where the big blinds are really, really low, you have to have these ranges nailed. Both your pushing ranges and your calling versus shove ranges. You have to have both of those done.
It's an interesting question because we get a lot of questions like this where the answer is to some degree embedded in the question itself, and it's really just a strategic understanding, a gap in that understanding. This person's clearly thinking in ranges in terms of what they have, but maybe isn't taking it to that next level where they're thinking, well, the other people realize that this is the range that I'm playing and I may be exploited.
100%. And this is where, if you're going to be playing this game consistently, and this is a situation that comes up consistently, then what I would challenge you to do is really create an off-table exploration time that works on this. So think about what are the pot odds that you're normally getting, or run it with the pot odds being a couple different ways, right? If you have really, really shallow stacks, slightly shallow stacks, and medium stacks. And then run through, okay, what kind of range do I think my opponent has? What does my equity look like when I have X, Y, or Z hand? And then really start understanding where your calling ranges can be. But if the only thing you do is no off-table study and in real time you're just trying to make this decision on the fly, you're not going to understand the math that goes into it well. You're not going to be able to estimate your equity well. You're not going to think about your opponent's range well enough. You're just going to be left back to what? What hole cards do I have? And again, that's an absolutely awful way to play poker. There's so much more that goes into it than just what are your hole cards. Your hole cards are a huge factor, don't get me wrong, especially in tournaments, but it's not the end-all be-all.
It reminds me, of the advice never limp, and it's not literal advice. You don't, literally never limp, but applying that to someone who limps far too often, it can be advantageous. In this case, I almost sometimes say to myself, forget about your hole cards. Not that you would ever literally do that, but it puts the focus so much more where it needs to be, which is on the other things going on at the table.
Right. So if momentarily you start by saying, okay, I'm going to ignore my hole cards, I'm going to look at what pot odds am I getting. I'm going to think about the range that my opponent is shoving, and is that likely good, likely to lose, something like that. And then we bring our hole cards back into the equation to say, okay, based upon our hole cards and the range that we think our opponent's shoving here, what's our estimated equity? How does that compare to the pot odds requirement? How does that compare to the rest of the things that we should be considering in a tournament? Again, like ICM and payouts and all that kind of fun stuff. And then make decisions from there. It's never just a what are my hole cards. If that's the end, if that's the start and end of the conversation, you've already lost. So again, it's once we identify that leak, it's easy to go fix it. There are going to be a lot of things you're going to have to keep in mind here, but that's okay. That's part of the beauty of this game. There are a lot of things to consider, and as we study them more off table, then in real time it's far easier to say, okay, this is what's going on here. Here's the best decision based upon the information I have, and then you can feel comfortable and confident in that decision rather than just guessing and getting frustrated because you didn't wake up with enough big hands in a sit and go or a tournament.
Right. And, that being said, there are those specific hands that create even additional problems and complications. Trouble hands like jacks or ace king is one where a lot of people, talk about difficulties playing that. In fact, that's kind of why you're writing a book all about ace king, right?
Exactly right. But that's the thing. Like once you start looking even at like a singular hand like ace king, look at it within the context of your entire range, then your brain just opens up in all the right ways. So again, like never get so overly focused on your hole cards. They are a part of your range. They are a part of your strategy. And in tournaments, they're equity placeholders for sure. So again, they're definitely important. But again, if that's the extent of the conversation, you got some work to do. You got some work to do.
Well, this next question has several layers to it. It is about ace king and ace queen, those hands that we love to see but sometimes feel challenged by. And it's from Kick-Ass Poker, who asks, how do we play Ace King and Ace Queen in extremely loose games with 60 big blind stacks? How do we isolate knowing that the pot is bloated and we miss 66%? So a lot of going on here. I guess, are we going to miss 66%? Is that true?
About 2/3 of the time, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
how's that for one of the absolute best hands you can be dealt pre-flop is going to miss the flop 2/3 of the time? Welcome to it.
hey, I'm just trying to digest the aces cracked math, okay? That's painful enough as it is. I don't need to get into ace king. But what are we doing in an extremely loose game in this situation? We've got kind of a short stack, and we've got these hands. Are we just ripping it in, or what are we doing?
All right, so 60 bigs is a little bit difficult to start ripping in. Like, you don't like open shove with 60 bigs pre-flop, and oftentimes if there's an open raise, 3-bet shoving could be an option, depends on how large the open raise was in the first place, but more often than not, your edge here is going to come from understanding the 3-bet game, understanding the 4-bet game, and understanding your SPR, your flop play, in kind of like medium, really shallow SPRs. Right, because if you open, get one caller, you're not in the deepest SPR come the flop, and you need to know how you're going to handle that when you hit, which is usually pretty easy. Usually it's continue betting and get sticky, or if you miss, which can sometimes be a lot more complicated, especially when we're talking about 3, 4, and 5 SPR pots. Now, if you're playing in a really loose, wacky game, then these might be a lot of multi-way pots, which inherently means a much smaller SPR. So again, we go right back to what is our strategy in there. So I don't say this to like give like very, very specific advice other than typically play this hand very, very aggressively. What I will say though is this is probably going to point to where a lot of your off-table study time is going to be. Is the pre-flop stuff, 3-bet, 4-bet wars, and then the flop stuff on the smaller SPRs. Because you need to know, okay, if we go 3-way to it and we miss the flop and it's 2.6 SPR, what am I going to do here? Now, 2.6 is very specific, and I'm not saying get lost and study it down to that decimal point, but you should understand at 2 SPR, when do you shove? 2.5, when do you shove? 3 SPR, when do you shove? And once you can start understanding that, what goes into the profitable shove, when you can expect it to be a profitable shove, when shoving when you miss would just be a horrible idea, when c-betting would be good versus bad, it's going to give you a more well-rounded idea, which is also going to give you more pre-flop confidence to say, okay, this is a spot where I don't necessarily need to always 3-bet or 4-bet, because my edge can actually be higher going post-flop, so maybe I'll just call pre-flop instead of 3-betting and go forward. So I'm not trying to give like an overly rambly answer, more of a this is where you would start studying, because there's so much that goes into playing this situation profitably. It's not just a black and white always do X or always do Y. Rather, if you can understand how the pre-flop factors in, how the flop factors in, based upon the flop edges, how does that factor back to pre-flop, then you can have a really well-rounded idea on how to handle this game, both when it's at the 60 big blind depth and when you eventually double up and have to start playing this at the 120, 150 big blind depth as well.
Yeah, I like this. We're kind of building a theme, in which, poker is a complex interplay of information and systems. And we're saying, by taking a hand like Ace King and saying, I'm going to look at it under the microscope, you can sort of identify, part of the system and the ways that that connects to the other parts, and really appreciate things like ranges and, bet sizing and all those things and lines of action just from holding one variable constant. And you could do that with anything. You could do that with range. You could do that with bet sizing. And it's often a really great way, I think, that everyone shares with me to learn how to be better at poker.
Yeah, and it's going to force you to explore a lot more of those things, right? Because I'm not saying that in a 2 SPR pot, your only options are to open, shove, or check, right? There's normal c-betting, there's smaller c-betting, there's 1.5x c-betting, there's lots of options that are available as well. So it will force you to say, okay, well, what the heck is going on here? When would a shove be good? When would a check be good? And when would other things be good? Because the more things that you can explore off table, the easier it is later to say, okay, this is what I remember from my study. This is going to inform when I should be playing aggressive versus a little more passive, and then make a decision. And that's why I think it's more important to have an off-table study plan, what you should be studying based upon what's going to influence and impact your win rate most in real time, rather than just saying, always do X, always do Y, always study this really inane spot. No, I don't think that's going to be best. Have a study plan that influences your overall win rate and edge differential as a whole.
Right. Yeah, it always comes back to the plan, and everyone's going to have their own plan that they put together for themselves, picked from disparate sources, some red chip stuff, maybe from somewhere else, different coaches, but ultimately, you develop your own strategies and your own styles based on the information that you're taking in and organizing and analyzing. So,
Yep.
got to have a plan. And
Truth.
these last two questions really hit home for me because I play in games like this all the time, and I think a lot of people out there playing games like these. And at first, I grouped these into our questions here on aggression, but I'm starting to wonder if these are really aggression questions, because we often find ourselves in games where people are calling raises all over the place. And I'll read the two questions and then kind of wrap it up with the final question that I have for you. So Jay Gingrich writes, in live games where there are multiple callers in raised pots, what range of hands do you want to get involved with other than pairs? The other question from Tigers, if I'm playing in a very loose aggressive game where three people might see the flop after a 5 to 8 big blind open, how can I adjust to that? So both of these are talking about those games where you raise and you get called in 3 or 4 spots. Every 1-2 game I play, it seems, is like this. And to wrap it up into my question, I've always looked at these as aggressive situations, but what I'm kind of wondering is that an aggressive situation, or is that passive play? Is that an opportunity to profit? Is this something that we as poker players shouldn't be bemoaning, oh, I have to sit at this table where everyone's going to call my raise, and look at it more as an opportunity to exploit that?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things that you're bringing up all at once here, so we're doing our best to kind of hack through it. You are exactly right. This is not just a bare bones, should we play aggressive? And if yes, what should we play aggressive with? This is also now starting to look at what are the options that I have available to me, not just in terms of should I limp behind or should I open or should I isolate, but if I am going to isolate, what bet size is going to work best? Right? Because again, a lot of people get stuck in playing very, very static, and they say, okay, well, I know my normal raise size here is going to be to 5 big blinds, and they go to 5 bigs. Or it's going to be a 7 and they go to 7. But there's no thought of like, what would happen if I go to 15? What would happen if I even just went to 10? What would happen if I went a little smaller? And I'm not saying that any of those are inherently best. Rather, you should be at least asking yourself these questions, because oftentimes there can be a huge difference between raising to 7 big blinds over a few limpers and raising to 12. And if 12 can do way more profitable things, yes, I'm exposing an extra 5 big blinds pre-flop, but if it can create a way more profitable scenario for me, why not do that? So again, this whole thing is like very, very broad strokes, big picture point of view. But the big thing I think about here is, first and foremost, could I aggress? Right? And unfortunately, the two questions are a little conflicting, because one's talking about open raising, one's talking about isolating. But just in general, I ask myself, okay, do I think aggression is best here? And if I do aggress, what do I think is likely to happen? Right? And just do that first with like your normal default raise size. So if you're isolating over 2 limpers and your default raise size here would be to say 6 big blinds, then say, okay, what would happen here? Is that good? Is that bad? Because in some games you could raise that to 6 bigs and you end up going 4 or 5 way to it. Right? Because a bunch of players behind you call, the blinds call, the limpers call, everyone's in there with you. And is my edge going to be best in that pot? Probably not. Most hands aren't going to perform as best in that situation. And even if you have like a suited connector that plays well in a multi-way pot, well, now you're getting the smaller SPR, and is your hand going to play as best in that, where drawing is going to become more difficult? Probably not. So again, then I started saying, okay, well, what if I used a bigger size? What does that do? What if I use an even bigger size? What does that do? Which of these do I think creates the maximum expectation, the best possible spot for my hand? And that's not to say that every single plan that I have is going to come to fruition, right? I may say, okay, I'm going to raise here to 12 big blinds to try to isolate, and unfortunately I end up getting 4 callers. Didn't expect to get 4 callers. I thought I was only going to get 0 or maybe 1 caller, and unfortunately I walked away with a 4. Doesn't mean my plan was bad. Not necessarily, if I was being really honest and objective with my answers, but I have to say that because a lot of people will say, well, that was my plan and it went awry, so obviously I made a mistake. Maybe, but maybe not at the same time. So again, if you're being honest and objective with the answers to your checklist questions pre-flop, then you can feel confident in, oh, okay, well, this thing just got away from me. It happens. That's why we have a bankroll, right?
Yeah, because I think that's...
Yeah, continue on, because I know there's a lot here to hack apart.
Yeah, no, but it's a mindset thing kind of too, because I feel like so many people are showing up playing fit or fold, and we were talking about focusing on the bet size and the pre-flop race bet sizing, and in these games I feel like I'm sitting at a Caribbean stud game or a table game where the players are just simply like putting out their, limping in, and then seeing the size of the raise and being, okay, well, I'll call that, anything lower than $15. So it gets in that pain threshold. And what I found is that as I try and press that, maybe I'll bet 20 instead of 15, you immediately pop up on their radar. And sometimes that's good. Sometimes then they'll play at you emotionally. And other times they'll say, this guy's trying to, pull some moves on me. So now I'm going to play very conscientiously against this person. And I guess I'm wondering if you have any tips for navigating that situation, because it seems like immediately upon adjusting this specific area of your game, it gets noticed more than anything else, even by non-studied poker players, because that's the one thing they're paying attention to is, what do I have to put in to see the flop?
Yeah. So it's very difficult to figure out exactly how they're going to adjust to it. Because like you said, some people start coming after you. Some people just say, you know what, that's just not a bet size I want to play. And they continue doing the limp folding things. Others say, you know what, I don't really want to pay that size. So they stop doing the limping altogether and they just start folding instead. So there's like a bunch of different adjustments here. And I can't give like broad strokes advice confidently because it can range all over the place. But what I would say is heavily note who is still just going to be in the limp call mode. Because some players, like you said, they came and they have to see flops. And if that's the case, that means you can go huge with your monster hands because they become incredibly inelastic pre-flop, and that's great. And then the other thing you have to think about is you're sometimes going to walk into these landmines where one person is incredibly inelastic, but one of the other limpers is not. Right? So now you have to think about, okay, well, where is the inelastic person compared to the elastic person? Because if I go too big, then I blow off the elastic person but get the inelastic, and is that good? If the inelastic person is ready to go first and they call, will the person who is elastic all of a sudden say, well, I'm getting a better price now and I'm closing action, so now all of a sudden they start giving action more. So I'm not it seems like I'm like overloading with extra variables unnecessarily, but at the end of the day, like a lot of these situations just become like very limpy, and you have to decide, okay, what size is going to be best here? What am I trying to accomplish here? And what's going to be best other than just LOL, I has big hand, I raise. Or I have weak hand, what do I do? Like that can't be the extent of the thought process.
Right. It almost sounds like do anything except just continue what you're doing, because that's the definition of insanity. You don't want to keep showing up at these tables, and it's going to be a very frustrating experience if you don't make certain adjustments. And then it becomes more fun because poker is a dynamic game. You shouldn't just show up and say, I'm going to do this for the next 8 hours. That would be super boring. You get to interact with and adjust to all the different players. And perhaps if you are a studied thinking player, they're not moving as much as you are, but that's to your advantage and your benefit and your edge, right?
Yeah, and I will say one other thing, because I think it's really important here, is thinking about your edge on this table versus your edge on other tables, assuming that's an option. Right, so if you're playing in a card room and there's 5 games going and you're playing on one of them and one of them is playing like this, ask yourself, what is your edge on this game? And what is your edge on a quote-unquote more normal 2-5 game? Because you may find that you can actually make a pretty good hourly in this loose game, but it may not be the best hourly possible for you. Because say you're playing in this really loose game and there's just like no pre-flop pressure, no size you can use that generates any folds. So every pot is going super multi-way. Well, the more multi-way you go, the more reliant on actually hitting hands you have to be. Because oftentimes it's going to be much more difficult to generate a lot of folds post-flop in these multi-way pots and just in general in this kind of game. So because of that, folding is something that I really like taking advantage of. Players who fold too much are very easy money, it's low exposure money, and it's oftentimes very simple to generate an hourly. Versus if I get that option removed from me, now all of a sudden I have to hit hands, to me that's one of the most boring games I can play in. It can still be profitable, but it's boring as all hell. Right? Because I have to sit there, I have to make a hand, I have to try to get paid, I have to try to navigate the draws, and yada. That to me is very boring. So I have to ask myself, 1, which of these games is going to offer a higher win rate for me? 2, which of them is going to be more enjoyable for me? Because I could play in this game, but if I'm not going to enjoy myself, like you said, why spend 8 hours doing something that you hate when I could go do something either different altogether or different at a different table? So again, like, we can't just think about this as pure black and white, that's it. We also have to think about our other options, our other comparisons, our other edge differentials, and then make a decision from there. And this is, again, after already thinking about what are my sizing options, where's the pressure points, where's the folding coming in, if at all, and then making decisions strategically in the big picture and the small picture from there.
And that variety is one of the most fun parts about playing poker, and the reason why I think we love it so much. Anyone can walk into a poker room. Any type of player can sit down at your table. You can go to your same local casino every night and play in a different kind of game. So that variety just keeps it going. And if you're not on top of that variety, then you're not really playing at the top level that you could be playing at.
Exactly, because how many people go to their card room and they're like, I'm going to play my game tonight. Well, if your game is just totally fixed ranges and fixed bet sizes and fixed hand strengths post-flop, like, you're not maximizing at all. So a lot of the stuff we're talking about here and just in general when we're talking about training is understanding what goes into profitable decisions, getting away from being overly static, and really understanding how to make money and maximize expectation in a very dynamic way. That way you can handle when you're playing at a table like this that's really loose and aggressive. You can handle really loose passive tables. You can handle really tight tables. You can handle really tight aggressive tables. You have to be able to handle a whole bunch of spots if you want to maximize your hourly across the board. If you have one strategy that's built to beat one game type, you're going to be in a world of hurt when you play any other game that doesn't match that exact one, and that's not going to prepare you for playing the best poker you can across the board.
Well, this is one of those episodes where I feel really, really into playing poker right now, really inspired. I bet a lot of the red chippers out there do. I feel like my head has been crammed with information, and I'm going to see floating symbols and formulas and everything in front of my eyes at the table the next time, calculating people's VPIP and stuff. I'm just super zoned in, so thank you for bringing me to that state of poker mind.
For sure. It's what I'm here for.
Excellent. And we'll talk more poker soon. Sound good?
That sounds great. Thanks for having me, Zach.
Thanks for being on.